Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. And we are going to talk today about meaningful connectivity. And the session is called Meaningful Connectivity from COVID and Beyond. Meaningful connectivity, my colleague Teddy Woodhouse would explain the concept and the whole study we recently released in a minute. But basically, with COVID, we never have seen that concept as much needed as today, right? Everyone is realizing that connectivity itself, in many cases, is not necessary. We need to establish a level of quality and understand what this level is for everyone. So this session, I'm going to chair the session. My name is Nathalia Foditsch. I'm working at A4AI, that is an initiative from Web Foundation. We will have my colleague Teddy Woodhouse, who is a research manager at A4AI, discussing and telling us more about this concept of meaningful connectivity. We will have three great panelists, Olusola Teniola, who is the president of the Association of Telecommunication Companies of Nigeria and national coordinator for the A4AI-Nigeria Coalition. We'll have Osama Manzar, who is the founder and director of the Digital Empowerment Foundation. We'll have Valensiya Dresvyannikova, Policy and Research Officer at International Federation of Library Associations and Institutions. So first, just housekeeping items. We will open up for questions in the end of the sessions. But first, we will have Teddy presenting the meaningful connectivity concept, then discussing interventions by the panelists, and then opening up for questions. Thank you once again for being with us today. And we are looking forward to the questions and the interactions with you. Thank you. Teddy, please.
Perfect. Thanks, Natalia. And it's great to see everyone and have you join us today to talk about meaningful connectivity and how we can kind of help close the digital divide. We're really proud of this work at A4AI about kind of extending the debate around the digital divide and how we make internet access more meaningful and kind of more widely available for everyone. So I'll try to do a very quick introduction of the work and why we focused on this and some of the important concepts, and then give it back to Natalia and the panel to really dig into it and critique some of the work here if they'd like to as well. Really interested in hearing their feedback and your feedback as well in the chat as we kind of spend the rest of the hour going through this and kind of digging into it. So to quickly give you a starting point, the work that we've done starts from a map like this, which is a measure of the percentage of the population that is not using the internet. And here you see a very simple binary. It's two groups, those who have internet and those who don't. And in our work, we felt that this was a bit underwhelming. We wanted something with a little bit more punch and a little bit more detail about how internet users are benefiting from the internet, because simple measurement of use or no use includes someone who's simply checking an email account every week to a super user, for example, all of us who are using this for teleconference across different continents, all streaming video at the exact same time. Those are two very different experiences, and we wanted to represent that diversity here. And so that's one thing, is we wanted to add some complexity to that definition and add some detail to it. But also we've noticed from other organizations that there was kind of a shortcoming in what we were doing in measuring the internet today. That there was something around kind of meaningful access or meaningful connectivity that was something more than just simply being connected. And we wanted to represent that in our definition here. And why was this fundamentally important is because we wanted to confront the digital divide here. And if we don't do it appropriately, with a little bit of additional detail through work like meaningful connectivity, we risk kind of perpetuating coverage gaps and creating an illusion of coverage that says, okay, so maybe there's a 3G or a 4G network covering this area, but if someone's not able to use that network for one reason or another, they're not genuinely counted in those who are being able to use the internet and being able to kind of find a benefit of this incredible resource. And so for us, when we wanted to define what is meaningful connectivity, it really came down to 5 key things. We wanted it to be relevant to enable policy ambitions. So it's really a policy tool here, fundamentally, in what its motivation is. It has to be measurable. So we're hoping that over time, countries and other policymakers will use this kind of track their progress and see how they're evolving over years. This isn't necessarily a quick fix. This is a long trajectory that we're seeing ahead, and something we hope can kind of inform that and keep a pace of where there's space to still go, and also looking back where we've made progress over the past few years. It's a bit evidence-based. So an important thing here is we kind of tailor this around what internet users have talked about, what they want and what they need. It's also gender responsive. So you'll notice each of the 4 indicators for meaningful connectivity have an element that can be gender disaggregated. And we think that's really important, that we're not measuring just the digital divide, but we're talking about the digital gender gap as well, and measuring where there are differences in terms of access on the terms of gender as well. And then also from here, kind of an assumption we take is that people are accessing the open internet. And that's talking about an exclusion of artificial restriction, whether those are political or economic. So for example, censorship or a network shutdown is not meaningful connectivity. So excluding that as well comes into the definition. So first, there's 4 aspects we focused on. It's sufficient speed, a smart device, sufficient data to download the big things, and sufficient relevance that people are wanting to use this on a daily basis. And so converting those into indicators, what we focused on was, for sufficient speed, it's having a 4G mobile connection. For smart device, it's having, at minimum, access to a smartphone. For sufficient data, it's an unlimited connection point at home or a place of work or study. And then internet daily use as that 4th indicator, really measuring it to make sure that we're not just doing this for its own benefit, but there is actual use of this tool and this resource. So what is meaningful connectivity? For us, it's when a user has access to a smartphone and 4G mobile internet, along with an unlimited access point at home or place of work or study every day. So I'll quickly go into each of those 4 elements a bit, just to give some depth to the definition, and then summarize kind of how we're understanding this and where we're thinking this in terms of the steps ahead. So to start, talking about 4G connection, why we set it around here is when we were talking to users in surveys that we were doing in Colombia, Ghana, and Indonesia, people wanted and preferred audiovisual content. So that was kind of the minimum we worked with, was video. We want people to be able to use video, because once you have the technical standard to withstand that kind of level of information and that level of bandwidth, you can use the breadth of the internet and what else it has to offer. And unfortunately, 3G as a technological generation just simply wasn't designed to sustain speeds like that indefinitely and kind of with a stronger guarantee, whereas 4G does have this theoretical expectation that does meet this minimum criteria. And why are we talking about 3G instead of 4G, and 4G instead of talking about a very specific number of bits per second? It's because these are easy to understand, and they're what people are talking about. So when we talk to people about how fast do you want your internet, they were replying to us saying, I want a 4G connection. One user even said you wanted to have an 8G connection. That's to say that you wanted something so fast that's more fast than like 5G or 6G. And so that's the language people are using to understand speed. And so we wanted to reflect that, to see this not just as a way of measuring things, but as that policy tool that can be adopted by other organizations and other movements to advocate for better internet access where they are. So connecting on to the second indicator, that's about using a smartphone. And with that audiovisual content point in the first one, it's not just about consuming it, it's about creating it as well. And cameras on smartphones are one of the best ways to create audiovisual content. People want to take photos of their lives and see what they're seeing and sharing it with friends and family. There are a number of other features that are really important with smartphones, just the portability, apps, and multifunctionality that really add a breadth of activities that are possible with a smartphone that aren't possible with other more limited devices. But also things like voice recognition, which enables connectivity for populations such as those with lower literacy or people with disabilities to kind of still use the internet and use it meaningfully in a way that's appropriate for them. And then also importantly, when we were doing some survey work in those 3 countries I mentioned of Colombia, Ghana, and Indonesia, this was the device that had the lowest gender gap. compared to desktops or tablets. And that's to say that if we're trying to focus on really advancing users' autonomy and letting internet users choose for themselves what they want to do online, setting a target around smartphones per person rather than, say, desktops per household was seen to be an important indicator, so that they're, each user is getting to choose for themselves how they use the internet and how they're able to interact and what content they're able to load, rather than that necessarily having to be reflected into kind of household dynamics and some of the gendered dimensions there that can limit access for vulnerable populations. Onto the third threshold, it's about accessing a limited access point at home or a place of work or study. If you're like me, you kind of know this kind of as an informal practice, and this came out in our qualitative data. So it wasn't necessarily something we measured in surveys, but something that we heard as kind of a common practice for everyone of you wait until you get to a Wi-Fi point to do a really big activity or download something or check something out. And we wanted to reflect that into our definition as well. And so you see this kind of oasis effect where people don't ration their data in the same way as when they're in mobility or moving around, that they come to a point. And we focused on places that people were on a daily basis. So it's home or work or school, and using those places as kind of the anchor points for greater connectivity. Public access is a huge part of this agenda, and kind of creates additional oases for people to use and connect with the internet. And then also, but an important component that we wanted to emphasize here is privacy as well. So that there's a value of, for example, having access at home is people have greater privacy of, so if they're looking up sensitive content, there's kind of less stigma around that, or less risk of being caught out and subject to social pressures there based off what someone's looking up in terms of their internet use. And then the last threshold is using internet daily. And this one was connected to the fact that we saw that more frequent users were more positive about the internet in terms of both its economic and social benefits, but also seeing that as really a good indicator of how meaningful connectivity pivots from not just being, internet access isn't just something good in its own right, but it's actually converts itself into a way that other benefits are seen, whether they're economic or educational or social in someone's life. So really seeing a transformative effect of internet access, not just being something good on its own, but something that's kind of helping deliver other goods for people. And so those are the 4 dimensions of meaningful connectivity that we focused on, and we tried to measure in those three countries I talked about earlier. And so in that work, we did some preliminary numbers that looks at and tries to measure this. So what we did is we come up with a percentage value of each of the 4 indicators. You take the average of the 4, and you get a meaningful connectivity score in that country. 2 things to note out here is you'll see that the number in all 3 countries is lower than the number of internet users in the country. And that's to show that there is a population in each of these countries that is counted in that simple binary of being online or offline, but won't necessarily have access to the resources and the kind of networking that really allows connectivity to be meaningful in someone's life as we're measuring it here. The other important thing here is that at the national level, we end up taking the average to go back to that idea of it being a relevant tool for policymakers. We want to encourage governments and private sector to make advancements in each of these 4 dimensions. And so advancement in any of these 4 contributes ultimately to the meaningful connectivity score and helps bring it up. But really trying to encourage that each of these 4 things are important and should be advanced as part of a kind of connectivity agenda from a national perspective. And so just to kind of reiterate that point of what we're trying to do here is this is the map we see, so that in every country you see that there's a number of people who are simply unconnected. Those are the gray circles that you see here. There's a population that is marginally connected, as we understand it, which is to say that they are counted in that simple binary, but they don't necessarily have access to meaningful connectivity. And then there's green dots, which is kind of the ideal space where we're trying to get as many people as possible, which is that standard of meaningful connectivity where they're having elements of all 4 of the thresholds within meaningful connectivity. And so what's our goal ultimately here as the Alliance for Affordable Internet? That's to bring people online. And that's to say that we want to convert more of those gray dots into orange dots. We want to extend meaningful connectivity to the margins. That's changing those orange dots into green dots, and ensure that internet access is affordable and meaningful for the greatest number possible. And so that's to say that we want to see as many green dots as possible in as many countries as possible, and also make sure that it's done affordably so that so the internet access isn't something that's limited on someone's income, but is genuinely possible and affordable for the whole spectrum of society. And so, yeah, that's a quick summary of the meaningful connectivity definition, and kind of digging into some of the detail. We can talk into the chat. And for now, I will hand it back over to Nathalia to bring in our discussants and make this a bit more interactive and dynamic. Nathalia, over to you.
Thank you, Teddy, for this super clear presentation. Olu, you've been super engaged in, developing the policies of broadband in Nigeria. Could you please tell us how this concept translates into your discussions in Nigeria, and why is that needed? Well, how are these discussions going on right now? Thank you.
Thank you, Nathalia and Teddy. That was a great presentation. Meaningful connectivity is another barometer, I would say, that challenges is not only the policymakers, but obviously the service providers as well. Nathalia, you sort of asked a very pertinent question. We've just recently in Nigeria concluded on an official launch of the Nigerian Broadband Plan, which is an update on the 2013-2018 broadband plan, and we have now just concluded on a 2020-2025 plan. And this really speaks to some aspects that Teddy has raised, even though we didn't call it meaningful connectivity. It's all encompasses the same thing, and it's around connectivity, handsets, devices, affordability, services, and education. We call that CHASE. Most service providers are aware of some of the unique issues that exist in emerging markets, and one of them is the deficit of infrastructure. And the deficit of infrastructure causes these walls of haves and have-nots. So yes, Teddy mentioned smartphones devices. We have in the broadband plan a target of having locally assembled smartphones at $50 per device by 2023. Well, that's a great target. I mean, but you have to consider the fact that in Nigeria, we're much more dependent on importation, not only of basic services, even food, we import food. So actually, where we don't manufacture phones, which is the case right now, you can see that the propensity and the barrier to actually having affordable phones is based on import duties, and also the fact that the propensity to spend beyond $50 is very small. The population that we've noted is about 15 to 20% of our population, and we have an estimated population of about 200 million Nigerians. So the 2G technology, and I don't want to make this a technical forum, but 2G is the standard. And why? Because about 20 years ago, we had hardly anyone who had a mobile phone and could make a voice call. So now we have 2G at 85% penetration. I like the bit that Teddy stated. You might have coverage, but actually, is there any meaningful access to the internet being performed? And in 2G areas, as you know, you already said 3G doesn't meet the speeds, 2G doesn't. So you can see that with the deployment of 3G, which is far less than 4G in Nigeria, we actually have a predominance of those who are probably not really connected meaningfully. It's not that they don't have access to the internet, but they're using the old technologies that we may have discarded in the more advanced jurisdictions. So the conversations that we're having around the broadband plan is, A, are we able to achieve a minimum speed in the rural and the urban areas? It does create somewhat of a divide there because it's almost emphasizing that there's more propensity and probability of us solving the meaningful connectivity issues in urban areas. And you tend to find that in Nigeria, for instance, we have a golden triangle. And I think that might correspond to different cities around the world, where you have those that can afford living in the cities. They tend to have maybe fiber to the home, or in the case of unlimited data access or bundling, they can afford them. But as you go further out to the rural areas, that isn't the case. So in Nigeria, we have Lagos, we have Abuja, and Port Harcourt. For those who are not aware, Lagos is the commercial capital, Abuja is the federal and the capital of Nigeria, and Port Harcourt is the oil city. So you tend to find that there's a congregation of not only supply, but demand. So we do see aspects of what Teddy has highlighted in meaningful connectivity in the cities, but that's not where the problems lie. Because as you know, as a country, we have 42% of our population lives below the poverty line. So we're trying to address the affordability issue, let alone the accessibility and availability. And then you have an overlay of meaningful connectivity. So as policy decision makers, and what we do in ATCON and A4AI, as wear both hats, is to try and get civil society, the consumers, government officials to try and understand some of the low-hanging fruits. And the low-hanging fruits for us is essentially we need to roll out 4G. 4G technology is deemed the minimum because over-the-top applications widely used in Nigeria are very data hungry. And data hungry in the sense that the way they've written, they're not light, they're more heavy-ended. And that's really a technology push. So we need 4G. We're coming from 35% geographical coverage to an ambition of 90% by 2025. And that should translate into a 70% individual penetration. Because as you know, in Nigeria and probably in Africa, most people are now identified using a mobile handset. And I like the pitch that Ted also pushed. It's mobile connectivity as opposed to fixed line. The reality in Nigeria is that enterprise markets do have meaningful connectivity, and they do depend on fixed line broadband, but again, the upper rates on those are very high, and they don't translate to your ordinary consumer or the bottom of the pyramid. So what we're doing is over the next year to 2 to 3 years, we're fortunate to be on as A4AI represented on the Broadband Implementation Steering Committee. We are trying to obviously create, I would say, confidence in our ability to drive these multi-stakeholder and to drive these multi-stakeholder issues because they are very complex in the sense of trying to remove some of the input costs that are actually barriers to us achieving affordable internet. And then I think the next focus will be on actually trying to attain meaningful connectivity in those rural areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olu. Well, let's do questions later. I'm sure we all have questions to you. But Osama, would you like to tell us about the experience in regards to these concepts in India, please?
Yeah, thank you very much, Nathalia. It's very interesting. I was, although we were part of this development, but I was really going through each line that Teddy was saying, the meaningful connectivity, and it's depressing actually. If you really put the connectivity in the brackets of the definition of meaningful connectivity, you actually feel ashamed of many situations that we are prevailed with. I mean, for example, India claims that 1+ billion connectivity, which actually comes to almost like 5% or even 2% or 3% in terms of meaningful connectivity. Because as it is, the number of SIM cards that you sell is not the connectivity. Number of smartphone you sell is not really the connectivity. Number of feature phones you sell is not really the connectivity. I mean, do we have the connectivity that I can access my education? Do we have the connectivity that I can do classes online? Do I have the connectivity that I can learn from audio and video, audio visual or video enabled connectivity? And then it all falls flat. So just to give the numbers that, just to bring the meaningful connectivity in perspective, especially at the time of COVID, where the dependency on connectivity is so important and so critical and so, so much more than there is no alternative except to be connected, For example, as I was listening to you, I was getting WhatsApp messages of the national education policy, which has just been released by the government of India today. And while they say that we have to go online, there is no infrastructure, Our best infrastructure is 2G, Our best infrastructure is the non-availability of tower. you know, and that's the mass scale. So it's a very good definition to see yourself in the mirror, that what does the situation look like from the education perspective, from health perspective, from e-commerce perspective, from agriculture perspective, from trade perspective. Does it allow, let's say there are 26 million micro enterprises or nano enterprises, or the medium and small scale enterprises, which is MSMEs. But the point is, does this 26 million people able to do trade online? I mean, do business online? So I would say to the question that where does India fall? I mean, we may have to create what Teddy showed as orange balls and the gray balls and the red balls and the green balls. You know, is that where do we, in the infographics, where do India fall? Unfortunately, India will fall with more grays and the oranges rather than in the green, because while we may boast that India has got one of the highest Facebook page connectors, you know, or the highest number of WhatsApp users, or the highest number of, even internet users as the second highest after China, and more than even US. The point is that, does it allow you to have a meaningful connectivity? Does it allow you to be secluded and isolated in the time of COVID, and you can access, you can do trading, or you can do business, or you can access education? I would say that India is more on 2G, less on 4G and 3G, and extremely low on 4G. So if you put the real numbers, India is more than 70% unconnected. Like your graph, your first slide also shows that India is in orange, not dark orange, but it is in orange, you know, which is actually having more people unconnected than connected. But even if you go to the numbers, India claims that 400 to 500 million smartphone users. But out of them, there are 200 million in urban areas and 200 million in rural areas. All the smartphones in rural areas would not have connectivity better than 2G or 3G. So even those smartphones cannot really produce meaningful connectivity results, you know, an outcome. And therefore, it may be a great hardware to be able to access great content, but you need speed. So on the parameters of having a smartphone, having 3G or 4G, and having availability and affordability, you know, India as a country is far behind.
Well, thank you, Osama. Valensiya, you have an interesting experience, which is a little different, right? You're not going to focus on a country specifically, but on how connectivity, public access connectivity happens in libraries. Can you tell us a little bit more about it, please?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Nathalia. Thank you, Teddy. So, of course, public internet access, including access to libraries, is part of the Meaningful Connectivity Standard Threshold 3, which is as part of places to access an unlimited broadband connection. And drawn on the experience of libraries across the world, I guess we would want to briefly go over the sort of global international view, and indeed zeroing on the public access aspects of the standard. So basically, why libraries, what this kind of public access oasis can achieve, and what could happen as you go forward with the MC standard. To briefly put this into context, so libraries have been part of the digital inclusion discourse going back as far as the 90s and early 2000s. Connecting all libraries with ICTs was actually one of the original WSIS 10 targets in 2003. And the reason behind this, as explained, for example, in the final target review, was that libraries and similar venues are in a position to provide digital access to knowledge and information as an already established network of institutions, which are generally open to the public. And in doing so, libraries in particular can serve as venues for informal education and capacity building, especially in promoting digital literacy for all. And public access in libraries continues and remains part of the discussion today, as recently as 2019-2020, when, for example, the latest ITU State of Broadband report included a recommendation on public access policies and low-cost access in locations like libraries and community centers. So that's the affordability perspective of it. So in 2020, unfortunately, with universal individual access, might be still not a reality for a while yet, which is why the standard looks at public access as well. So then why libraries alongside the work of formal place of work or study? And this is, of course, the library field take on the public access to complement the A4AI perspective. Well, first, this can help offer a sort of catch-all safety net that remains open to the potentially more vulnerable groups and populations. For self-employed workers, those in vulnerable employment, youth not in employment, education or training, and others. Should such groups happen to not have home broadband access, nor be able to access broadband through work or formal education institutions, libraries can offer a fallback opportunity for meaningful broadband access. And this can be key for the more potentially vulnerable groups. In the US, for example, 2016 data suggests that more women than men tend to use library computers and the internet. More people of color, younger people, people with a lower income. 2017 IFLA Development and Access to Information report points out that in Indonesia, a public library program that equipped libraries with ICT, connectivity, training for librarians, it expanded access to information for the public, and women made up nearly 2/3 of users within this library program. So this kind of oasis could also help implement targeted inclusion initiatives towards such groups. Public access in libraries can also come as a more sort of package deal with access to the internet, access to computers, which could come in handy for example, mobile first or mobile only users to get access to a wider range of devices if needed, as well as digital skills training, the ability to ask trained staff for support. While skills are not directly measured in the standard, of course, it's an important part of the overall inclusion question. And these kind of broadband oases, this kind of public access, can actually be very versatile and productive. Recent US statistics show that 60% of library public access computers are used for maintaining social connections, 41% for education, 40% for employment and work-related reasons. And there are, of course, other uses like digital finance or entrepreneurship, which are also fairly widespread. 2013 report by the University of Washington's Technology and Social Change Group also offered an in-depth examination of public access venues in Bangladesh, Brazil, Chile, and Ghana, and the Philippines. Library users have reported positive impacts in such areas as education, access to government information services, local language and cultural activities, or health even. So with these roles of libraries in mind, a broadband sort of safety net for the potentially more vulnerable populations, digital skills learning opportunities, access to trusted content and information, these have been the roles to date. Then what can change with the meaningful connectivity standard? Well, first, it's of course useful for public access venues, especially libraries, to effectively contextualize and define the role they're playing in digital inclusion today, not as competition to individual access, but as both stepping stones towards it and as complements to individual access. As has been pointed out, cost-saving and data-saving behaviors for many users are still a widespread phenomenon. And this kind of public access can be an important part of the affordability puzzle and an oasis even for existing users. Two is that around the world, in the next few years, as the timeframes of existing broadband policies run out, they'll potentially be reviewed, renewed, updated, new ones to be created. And this standard can help understand and measure meaningful connectivity in a given context, to come up with actionable solution plans. And in a comprehensive package of measures, public access in libraries can be a sort of, indeed, low-hanging fruit, as has already been mentioned. It's important to look for those sometimes, which is low-hanging fruit in a sense that it's comparatively easier to implement due to pre-existing infrastructure of these establishments. And in other areas where possible, we could also make the case that such anchor institutions as libraries, schools, could use connectivity of a higher speed and higher capacity to accommodate more users and more demanding, more creative uses. And finally, hopefully, this could also accelerate data collection on the existence of public access points in different national contexts to encourage states to track public internet access in libraries, schools, and so on. And even more broadly, collecting data on meaningful connectivity worldwide, global and comparable data, is of course crucial to both analysis and creation of actionable inclusion programs.
Thank you so much. Well, I would like to start making questions prior to opening up. My main question for all the panelists, maybe we can start with Olu, but for all the panelists, if we were to have a policy playbook, which we are actually planning to have soon, related to the meaningful connectivity standard, so a policy playbook that actually has more specific steps towards to achieving these goals, what would you like to see? What specific? You can tell me either about the format or the content specifically. What do you think will be helpful for you to have in terms of a policy playbook that explains how to reach these targets established in the meaningful connectivity standard?
Yes, thanks, Nathalia, and thanks, Valensiya and Osama, sorry. I believe that we obviously have some common issues to address, and Osama's touched on it, that affordability is the big elephant in the room. 2G networks will be around until service providers feel that there is a return on investment case for these higher speed networks, both 4G and soon to be 5G. If we are to avoid these digital divide gaps and to ensure that we carry those that are unconnected, as Osama has rightly pointed out, there's two parts to it, and I think Valensiya sort of touched on it. There's digital literacy and digital skills. You know, that's in Nigeria, I mean, we can't underestimate it. Curriculum is still based on the 1950s, and there's not been really updates. We have many lawyers, many doctors, all those traditional careers, and we're very good at that. But those areas of engineering, data scientists, all these things that are needed right now, that are really visible amongst the Gen X, or sorry, the Gen Ys and Gen Zs, are just emerging and breaking, and the curricula isn't keeping up with that. So the first thing I would say, policy around education, right from primary and secondary, not just tertiary, that's important, but definitely you bring them in young. And what are the areas? There's STEM, science, technology, education, and mathematics. So A4AI would be good to start to look at areas that addresses the fundamentals, and those are the fundamental issues. Then the other piece to it is, and I think that it's really important that we get African use cases, and probably we get some Indian use cases and others that are the focal points for A4AI. And those use cases are the benefits and the outcomes of what we're trying to achieve. And I think Valensiya also touched on that. It's education, online systems, maybe pull in connectivity to hospitals, to educational locations. We obviously have identified that if government is able to create a demand, and then you see that the issues around supply side will be addressed, whether it's through community networks or whether it's through a broadband policy framework the rule actually that we're trying to introduce, because it will make sense. At the moment, it's really difficult to align, I would say, more developed countries' use cases like autonomous cars in Nigeria. I mean, we have power issues, for instance. I don't see anyone using electric cars for quite some time because we've got some fundamental electric gaps. And our industry, for instance, is totally reliant on diesel, hydrocarbon generators, two each at each site. And we have about 39,000 sites. So you can see the magnitude of the problem. So, we got to, I believe, and as an approach, identify those low-hanging fruits. I'm going to repeat it, low-hanging fruits, because you can't convince government with this Nirvana approach. And sorry, yeah, meaningful connectivity is a great one to achieve, but there's some fundamentals we got to achieve first. Otherwise, we're going to set the bar so high, it will almost become, oh, well, we're never going to achieve this, why bother? And we don't want that to set in. So we can achieve the low-hanging fruits. I mean, I don't want to start to pinpoint on one, but I'm sure that we'll have an offline meeting to say which ones are the lowest hanging fruits and that A4AI is able to push. Then government can focus on what they need to do and then create an enabling environment for the service providers and the private sector to actually pull through, bring the necessary funding, adjust the pricing where they see there is a return on investment so that it becomes affordable not only to those in the urban cities, but also to those in the rurals who need it more to actually ensure there's no digital divide. Thank you.
Thank you, Olu. Thank you for pointing out this sort of disconnect between, the actual policies and the digital literacy curricula that actually most times didn't used to realize that all professions would actually need literacy, right? Not only the technical ones. I think that was one major issue. Well, maybe I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation on the literacy issue, because that might, depending on how we frame this, might be one of the low-hanging fruits you're mentioning, right? Because a lot of times the broadband plans were not really focusing on that, focusing only on infrastructure only, right? I'm also wondering, I mean, for Osama and every panelist, I think the COVID might have shown this disconnect between some of the things that are being discussed at a global level. There are major technological advancements, right? As Olu mentioned, self-driving cars, let's say, whereas in many places you still need to think about things like electricity, how to provide connectivity if you have enough electricity, for example. So I'm wondering to what extent COVID crisis has exposed this disconnect between what we actually need to implement in terms of practical measures and steps, and if any relevant decisions have made this clearer and have helped advancing that goal of reaching actual connectivity and meaningful connectivity, and reaching the goals we are talking about.
Thank you, Nathalia. COVID has just not exposed, just few things. It has actually exposed fundamentally very important thing is last mile connectivity. That means your movement is restricted physically, and therefore, if you can't reach to the water, water has to reach to you. If you can't go to the river has to come to you. If you can't go to the connectivity has to come to you. So whether it's device, whether it's connectivity, and since connectivity actually links many more things as an enabler. For example, if you are connected, then I don't have to reach to the bank can come to me easily. If I have connectivity, I don't have to walk to the school, but the education can reach to me conveniently. The teacher in audiovisual manner can reach to me conveniently. And therefore, the whole supply chain in physicality and in reality and in virtuality is actually exposed us that how much we were dependent on internationalization or globalization of supply chain, and therefore dependency on something which is not locally available to you, but something which is away. And therefore, I feel that this fundamentally connects us to realize that digital connectivity and digital device affordability is one of the most important highlight that COVID has actually exposed us. And therefore, I would say that the defining what is connectivity, defining what is meaningful connectivity, and defining what is quality connectivity is actually coming into the definition to discuss much more, because earlier we were thinking more about digital inclusion. And then we were talking about 15 years back about digital divide, or 20 years back digital divide. Why suddenly after 20 years, with a gap of digital inclusion being discussed and then digital exclusion being discussed, we are suddenly again talking about digital divide? It should have been a passe. But no, our dependency on, digital divide today is not a result of aspiration to be digitally included, but it is a sad situation of digitally being excluded. If you are digitally divided on the other side, wrong side of the digital divide, then you are actually excluded. And meaningful connectivity definition makes me even more excluded. It is something like whether you are eating just food to fill your tummy, or eating food with quality to be healthy and not to get sick again and again and again, and to be attacked by the viruses. So meaningful connectivity is that kind of thing that it is very important that we realized, and we actually see it as an extremely critical things for national policy, for regional policy, for local policy, for state policy like India, where there are a lot of provinces. It is very, very important that we see it as that how we are working in terms of policy to enhance the last mile connectivity in such a manner that the meaningful connectivity come into the force of being implemented. And we also redefine that last mile connectivity is just not a connectivity down the street, but it is last mile connectivity here is down up to the level of my drawing room and my bedroom and my household. That's very, very important. And that is the way we are going to look at in the next few years, where we are not going to compromise to have a connectivity which is weak, which is compromised, which is not enough to do all kind of activity that is required. If we are not doing that, that means we are certainly dealing about connectivity in a very classist, racist, and in a manner of economical deprivation way. If we are not giving meaningful connectivity, that means policy wise we want to deprive a certain country or a certain region or a certain state or a province in any country. So the approach to policy to have a comprehensive, meaningful connectivity and fast, whether it's a private organization that provides connectivity or it's a non-private or a government organization provides the connectivity, our policy should be pushed to the level of non-compromising. So the definition of even fundamental rights, we should actually put in that fundamental right is just not access to broadband, but it's a meaningful access to broadband or a meaningful connectivity to broadband, or something like that, which should have a threshold mark, which is not less than 1 Mbps or 10 Mbps or whatever it makes sense. And that's very, very important.
Yeah, I think this sense that we got of this spatial recognition, right, of how important it is to have connectivity close to us rather than discussing, connectivity itself. But we realize that, well, now with distancing, I've been in my house for over 4 months now, right? So if I didn't have connectivity, I wouldn't be able to be right here, right now. So last mile is certainly a super important topic and as a policy goal too. I think I will like talking about the way in which we can advocate for meaningful connectivity standard, and going back again to a playbook. I know that Valensiya your organization has developed a sort of toolkit that is similar to what we are planning to do with the meaningful connectivity playbook. Do you have anything to share with us in regards to how you advocated for this toolkit, and anything that might be like a lesson for us?
Sure, of course. So basically, what the toolkit you've mentioned, the public access policy toolkit, is something that the Dynamic Coalition, IFLA, as part of the Dynamic Coalition, on public access in libraries within the Internet Governance Forum has created a few years back. And its purpose was, still is, of course, is to look into the broader policy context of what can affect an organization's ability to offer public access and what can affect an individual's ability to use it effectively and meaningfully. And indeed, that sort of feeds back to the question you've posed earlier as to what kind of policy areas should even be covered in a more comprehensive and a more in-depth toolkit that A4AI, for example, should you develop one. And the truth, the fact that how the IFLA toolkit ended up being structured is indeed there are so many policies that end up impacting an organization's ability to offer connectivity. It ranges from something very basic as physical infrastructure to regulations concerning networks, regulations concerning markets. You have naturally legal and privacy issues. You have finance and other resources. So indeed, there's a very complex interconnectivity of very different policies that end up impacting you. We have presented this toolkit both during the Internet Governance Forum of that year, as well as during the World Library and Information Congress of that year, for libraries to sort of use and adapt and look at former resources to see what's relevant for them. And indeed, on our to-do list is sort of adapting this to 2020, especially since quite a number of lessons have been learned about digital inclusion during the pandemic, still are. And just in terms of what happened during COVID, what is still happening, of course, it exposed the digital divides ever so painfully, and especially for public access facilities. This has been a big existential question of how do you continue providing public internet access when the building is unavailable, when we have to stay safe and may not be able to offer it in the same way as before. And of course, there are causes for optimism in seeing how some actors are able to adapt. You see examples of Wi-Fi hotspot lending programs sort of filling in the gap. You see some really creative uses like using bibliobuses and parking them in specific spots to give connectivity to a specific area where there isn't sufficient connectivity, or something as simple as lending computers, lending headsets, or just expanding the range of Wi-Fi in a given library building. But all of this, of course, needs to now be fed back into policy processes to make this relevant to 2020. For example, the rules around content access have sometimes shown that in COVID, we see that sometimes works that you would have been able to access in person, you cannot access digitally. And this shows the need to sort of adapt laws around content for the digital age and all those similar policy areas. That's why we are looking at, once again, revisiting the toolkit and maybe updating a few elements, including, for example, a reference to the meaningful connectivity standard.
Yeah, please do reference the meaningful connectivity standard. Thank you. Well, we only have a few minutes left, but we have a few comments and questions here. So one person is saying that the person agrees with Osama because one of the biggest challenges they have in mobile and statistics reported by the Communication Authority in Kenya is that they actually don't reflect the meaningful connectivity. Thank you for that comment. A question here for Olu related to specific targets in the broadband plan, and the person is talking specifically about gender targets and to what extent women are marginalized in the from these processes and what limits women from internet access and meaningful connectivity. Would you like to start with that, Olu?
Yes, thanks, Nathalia, and thanks for the question. Yes, we stated in the recent Nigerian broadband plan a target for minimum speeds, and if I can recall, we have speeds of rural and urban, as I stated earlier. So we got 5 megs to be achieved by 2023 in the rural areas and 10 megs in the cities. And then that goes up to 25 megs for the cities by 2025 and then 10 megs for the rural areas by 2025. And then we looked at the gender equality issue, and I think that's what they were stated, and it's really access to end user devices. As I stated, the affordability issue around smartphones was our target for 2023 of $50. 2025, we're looking at anything sub $25, which is a challenge for anyone who's had to operate a manufacturing plant or an assembly plant in this part of the world, in West Africa, especially Nigeria, with the electricity issue that I referred to. So that's one of the targets. And for gender, we're looking at 100% of women in this the National Social Investment Program, which is a government program for digital access. That equates to a target of 5 million women to close the gap, which is currently sitting at 15 to 10%. Again, these are statistics from the A4AI that we've used, and these are internet users, by the way, so not just women, but 5 million women that will be using internet. So that's a target. That's and they call it ambitious, but it's something that we have to start now rather than later, so that the gap doesn't increase any further, as I indicated about the digital divide. Thank you.
There is also a comment here on device affordability. The person is saying that in Kenya, one of the largest telcos, Safaricom, has begun a purchase plan to allow persons of low income brackets to afford smartphones. Challenge is that these are still low-end smartphones that don't necessarily support 4G, as you had said, thus limiting meaningful connectivity. I think that's an important comment and issue. Well, first, it is, and Teddy might tell us more about it. He and his team are developing a study on device affordability. So that's one of the major issues, as Osama has mentioned, Olu has mentioned. And I think it's necessary to discuss to what extent the public incentives should or should not support, devices that don't meet the standards we're talking about, right? But also, Teddy, would you like to just give like a quick comment on that, on device affordability?
Sure, yeah. I'll keep it brief just so we can leave some time for everyone to give closing remarks as well to say goodbye. But I think we are releasing a report quite shortly about device pricing. And I think there's an interesting connection with meaningful connectivity of you want to make devices as affordable as possible while not losing some of the core functionality. So a key part of that is, for example, some of the cheapest smartphones in a market might be restricted to just a 3G market. So it's a sense of it's more affordable, but at the same time, you're automatically eliminating the potential for kind of those higher capacity networks and that connectivity to be part of someone's experience if they're buying that cheaper smartphone. So really, it's about kind of combining the two to make sure that devices are being affordable, but also facilitating meaningful use as part of a kind of comprehensive approach, kind of from a policy perspective.
Thank you. Would I like to also give, well, we have to finish the session now, unfortunately, but Teddy, what are your, in 1 or 2 sentences, what would you like to leave the session with, people with?
Okay, 2 sentences. We're not alone. We need your help. Please join us. This is going to be a collaborative effort. That's 4 sentences, and I'll stop there. Okay. Who is next? Who would like to give final comments next, please?
I would like my colleague Valensiya to give some comments. Ladies first, thank you.
Sure, thank you. I would second what Teddy said, that this needs to be a collaborative effort, that now more than ever we see the need for very active interventions, and indeed to encourage all actors involved to explore whatever possibilities there are to really bring this meaningful connection into reality.
Thank you. Osama?
Yeah, I would just like to add that meaningful connectivity should be treated as a policy benchmark. and to make it further understandable from the for the governments of the unconnected population of various countries. It should be more. It should be made more contextual. That meaningful connectivity in health, meaningful connectivity in food, meaningful connectivity for water, meaningful connectivity for education, meaningful connectivity from all line sectors, which actually fulfills our life and actually make it more relevant. So that people do not see connectivity as just an enabler, but also an essential part of our daily business.
Thank you. That's a good remark. And Olu?
Yeah, very quickly, because I know we've run out of time. I agree with all the comments and the remarks, and I would just like to add with one word: collaboration.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you to all of you. That was really interesting, and I'm looking forward to more discussions. Thank you to the RightsCon organization, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you. Have a great day and great evening, afternoon. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. It was great discussion, and see you around virtually at RightsCon in more sessions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Nathalia. Well done.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Teddy. Cheers.